Hello and welcome to my channel. Let's chat for a bit about By Steppe, Desert and Ocean, The Birth of Eurasia by Barry Cunliffe. This is a book that I recently finished reading and I wanted to get a quick chat done on it while it's still somewhat fresh in my mind. It's been a few days since I finished it. This was originally published in 2015 and this edition that I read apparently is from the 2017 paperback edition, and the author Barry Cunliffe, I read up about the author in this edition, and he was the professor of European archaeology at Oxford between the years 1972 and 2008, so he comes highly credentialed. This book does contain a lot of archaeology, so of course I loved it. But yeah, why I wanted to read this, so this fit into my 2018 reading priority theme of it was one of my history selections. So I wanted to read another kind of one of these big histories because last year I had read a book called After the Ice, which was sort of the story of humanity globally between the years 10,000 to 5,000 BC. No, 20,000 to 5,000 BC. The years immediately following from the Ice Age, following down to like the year 5,000. This particular book covers the period of time about 10,000 BC up until 1300-ish AD. So I wanted to get another kind of one of these big history books read this year, and I'm super glad that I did because, as usual, I find this kind of a thing just extremely fascinating. So what it's about, it concerns Eurasia, Europe and the continent of Europe and Asia, and its development over the last, since 10,000 BC all the way up to 1300 AD, sort of how it came to be, recognizable to us now with the civilizations and cultures in place where they are now that we recognize. This all sort of became recognizable where we would recognize it in around 1300 AD, and this is sort of where this narrative starts. Of course, this is very ambitious because we're talking about a huge continent and we're talking about a lot of time. So 10,000 BC, the Ice Age is over at this point, and this climate's kind of stable, and the people of the Near East, sort of this area of southwestern Asia, the Fertile Crescent they call it, this area around Mesopotamia, is really working their way towards agriculture. Meanwhile, in the Far East, in what is now today China, the same thing was occurring in a couple of different locations. There was the millet, I think, culture of the north and the rice culture of the south of present-day China. But this movement towards agriculture and the domestication of animals really changed humanity forever and definitely changed Eurasia forever, and therefore the whole world. So what I thought I would do is I was going to kind of just pull up the table of contents here because to talk a little bit more about what the book is about, because a book like this has got covers so much time that really we couldn't I couldn't really describe it in too much detail. Don't think without running completely over, because just a single chapter. The author has a preface to this where he talks about the ambition of a book like this, where Alexander the Great might get just a really small mention, even though he was kind of an important person for the development of Europe and Asia. Although his empire didn't last that long, it had a big impact culturally, which affected the continent forever after that. But anyway, the author goes on to say in this foreword that each one of these sort of things that are touched on in this book could really be a whole chapter, a whole series of chapters. But in a book like this, everything needs to be condensed down. So I mentioned about agriculture, and then the book starts out though about geography, the geography of Asia and Europe and the Middle East, and how this we needed to have this sort of grounding, I think, in geography to be able to understand how people were able to move, because we're talking about before there was any sort of domestication of horses, and we're even talking before there was the wheel. So there wasn't an easy way at this point. Camels had not been domesticated yet. So where the pockets of these farming cultures started to develop, really the spread of that was dependent on the geography. China was sort of isolated with mountains and deserts, and then the steppe of Europe, which is Eurasia, which is right there sort of in the middle, is this wide, vast grassland that, where the horses are native. Horses are actually native. It was this culture that actually ultimately domesticated horses, and from which so much technology transfer between the West in Europe, the East in Asia and China, and then the South in like Persia and India. This steppe in the middle was sort of a crossroads for all of these pockets. This European pocket in the west of Greece, would eventually Greece and Anatolia, and ultimately later Rome, and then the rest of European history, but also Persia in the south. The transfer could occur through these sort of really small, little, narrow, really trails, I guess you could say. And so, yeah, I'll talk a little bit more about that here in a bit, though. But yeah, I mentioned horses. So horses were domesticated eventually. These towns that developed originally first down in Mesopotamia, down in the Southwest Asia, in the Near East, eventually became cities, eventually became civilizations, eventually became empires. Meanwhile, a sort of similar development was occurring within China. But China's outlook was, sort of, because it was sort of locked in by its geography. It had it concerned itself mainly with its region. In the south, it was sort of blocked by dense tropical forests. On the west, mountains, and also deserts. So it sort of functioned on its own, but nevertheless, technology and ideas did transfer. So the agriculture, like the wheat of the Near East, eventually found its way to China, and the rice and silk of China eventually found its way down through the steppe to the rest to Europe. So I just thought that was very, very fascinating. So kind of takeaways from it that I had was how much trade really influenced this movement, because this was really I think one of the main sort of inspirations for people to move, to take this risk, because it would have been a very long journey. But this trading goods, so the trading copper at one point was highly valued. Copper, silks of China. A lot of these goods were actually luxury goods and prestige goods, where different cultures held these items in prestige, and so these sort of prestige goods really drove luxury goods. We would call today, really drove a lot of that trade. And so I think that's kind of cool to think about how we don't really think of that as a good thing, right? There's sort of a waste. Sometimes I think we have this idea of luxury goods are a waste, and they're a drain on the system, but actually, in a lot of ways, they were the engine that drove a lot of this transfer. As people moved and interacted with each other, sort of fed by trade, then ideas were exchanged and technology was transferred. So I thought that was really super cool. So yeah, this book sort of traces this early development of towns, cities, empires. Ultimately, though, the Persian Empire develops. We have Greece and Rome, and China unifies. Another kind of cool takeaway I had from it was about this early period of China. I really enjoyed reading this history of early China, like the Warring States period, and some of the people involved during the Warring States period and the spring and autumn periods. I was thinking that these sound really familiar, and where these people came from in my mind was the Three Body Problem, which is the Chinese science fiction trilogy that I read last year. And part of it, there was actually an online game that pertained to the Warring States period of China in this novel, in these science fiction, the Three Body Problem Chinese science fiction book. And so I thought that was kind of cool that these historical figures in this book. From the steppe, desert, and ocean sort of recognizing those in this work of Chinese science fiction. I thought that was kind of fun. So, the other kind of takeaway I wanted to mention was history as connection. There's a quote in the introduction here that I thought I might just read in closing, because I think that it really sort of explains this idea of connection. That history is not always and doesn't have to be just a set of events like this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened. History is actually how everything connects. So it's like, because A developed the way that it did, it led to B occurring, and then what happened during B led to C. And so it's how everything is connected, and I just think that's a sort of an enriching way to think about history. And there's a quote from the book that I thought was sort of appropriate for this idea, and so I thought I'd read it. So it says, "History is far more than a series of events and the biographies of big names. It is the subtle interweaving of human actions spread over vast landscapes and through deep time, creating a dense fabric, every thread of which has significance. The wonder of it all lies in how interconnected everything is." This book is an attempt to explore the two big themes, connectivity and mobility, as they developed throughout Eurasia from early prehistory, binding the world into a single system by the 14th century AD. It is the story of the energizing relationship between sedentary states like China, the Near East, and later Europe, with the pastoral nomads of the steppe, whose huge homeland spread from Mongolia to Hungary, and with the maritime communities living around the ocean fringes. The steppe, the deserts, and the oceans created the connective tissue through which people, commodities, and ideas flowed. So yeah, I think that really describes the book as well, what the goal of the book was. I think this author did a pretty good job of telling this story of connectivity of this giant continent of Eurasia, and through this very long passage of time. So I think I will end the chat with that. I hope I did this book justice. I don't know that I did. I don't feel like I necessarily did. But there's just so much to it that it's really hard to sort of condense it down into a small chat. But yeah, I just think that it's always so interesting to sort of figure out and see how things came to be how they are, why the nation states that we know today are the way they are, and the way that what happened on Eurasia ultimately has impacted the entire world. So yeah, great read. So what I'm currently reading is For 2,000 Years by Mihail, Sebastian. This was originally published in 1934 in Romania, and this novel tells the story of a young Jewish student who's observing the world around him, the anti-Semitic world of the 1930s Romania. And so I just got started with this. I've only read the foreword, so I haven't really dived into it yet, but I will be doing that soon. And then my next planned read, I did a behind-the-scenes drawing to let the randomness of the universe choose my next book for me, and my next book is going to be Moby Dick as Philosophy, Plato, Melville, and Nietzsche by Mark Anderson. This is a nonfiction work all about Moby Dick, the philosophy of Moby Dick. And so I've been wanting to get to this for quite some time. So I'm looking forward to this. This will actually be mark my middle point in my priority reading list. So I will be halfway done when I finish this book. And then my next read, I'm thinking about having a couple of interruption reads in April. There's a couple of new releases coming out that I'm excited to get to. So I'm thinking I might end up with 2, possibly even 3 interruption reads throughout the month of April, and I'll have more about that coming up in the near future. I'm also behind on an opera chat, and I'm behind on 2 more book chats, so I hope to get caught up very soon. So stay tuned. Take care. Bye.